Hi, this is Dr. Matt Bowker coming to you as a profounder professor, and today I would like to do Freud, Civilization and its Discontents Part 2. It's a heavy task to try to summarize and also give important details about the second half of this book in one short clip. I'm going to do my best, but I'm going to have to leave some things out, unfortunately. Um, to start with, the through line, I mean, the main argument of the second half of the book, and you could argue the whole book, is the introduction of this notion that since human beings are instinctively, inherently aggressive, they are going to come into conflict with the renunciations required by civilization, and that aggression is going to have to go somewhere. That aggression through a variety of means, and I want to point out a caveat about that later, ends up getting internalized. But again, I think there's an important caveat about that, and turned back upon the self through the function of the superego. So the aggression that you want to go outward ends up becoming blocked. That expression, that channel is blocked. The aggression then takes its force from the id, from the part of us that has the drive and the impulse and the instinctual energy, and punishes and aggresses against the self through the superego, which puts prohibitive restrictions on the ego and also makes it feel guilt and shame and punishes it by lashing out really against itself. That's the key argument. If you don't get anything else from the second half of Freud, that's kind of the key. There are a couple cute little moves that Freud makes that I think are important, that I'd like to highlight just along the way as we're getting through to that argument. And the first starts right off after Freud's, where we left off, after Freud's description of the totem and taboo primal father situation. Freud says civilization is and comes to be defined by two compulsions: the compulsion to work, which is defined essentially by necessity, and the power of love, which still remains with us in society and civilization. And we have to figure out what to do with that kind of love and eros. Um, the kind of possessive, you might even, and later we'll talk about why you can say this, you might even say aggressive love toward multiple objects is not acceptable in civilization. And so much of our loving energy gets aim inhibited. And that just simply means the aim or the object of what we would like to love, or take sexual pleasure from or derive satisfaction from, gets diffused and redirected toward another object. So, for instance, this is why Freud makes, I think, a really important intervention in what now we would consider an important part of women's studies and queer studies and everything else, and says, really, the only kind of love that civilization is going to let through, it has to make some kind of concession, or else the dam will break, right? So, the only kind of love that civilization is going to let through is cisgender, heterosexual, monogamous, genital love and marriage, and everything else is not okay, right? And so these are not sanctioned by civilization except this one little form. And so all of these other forms are considered deviations or diversions or perversions in Freud's time, and to some extent, one would argue still today, unfortunately. And that's just because civilization has to do something with the amount of that aggressive love, that loving impulse, and it needs to have some way of finding expression in society. The rest of it, he argues, gets diffused out into this love of humankind, which he is very pessimistic about and thinks that this is just a kind of a a sloppy idea that we can really love humankind in any meaningful way. There's too many people. There's people we don't know. How are we really supposed to love them? It would diffuse, if you think about it in just as terms of almost like physics, the amount or quantity or volume of love we have would have to be spread around so many people that the love for each individual that we haven't never met halfway around the world would have to be so tiny that it would be microscopic and essentially not meaningful. So he's very, very pessimistic about this. So this love thy neighbor stuff, Freud says, is wrongheaded, and it's wrongheaded for A number of reasons. The primary one is that man, once again, or humankind, is not essentially just a loving creature, but carries within himself, herself, themselves, ourselves, share of aggression that is just basic and primal, and that needs to be contended with in some other way. That's the shift in really part five. This is the move from aggression um, as a secondary effect to focusing on aggression as it turns back on the self. So civilization forces us, and it has to work hard to curb our aggression, forces us to either satisfy our aggressive energies through, we went through some of these last time, through substitute satisfactions, diversions, aim inhibitions, sublimations. Now he'll talk more about psychic reaction formations against aggression, which would be the opposite, a sort of kind of like excessive passivity, um, sublimation again, our identifications with the members of our community, which is this diffuse kind of love and identification with being a member of a group, um, or aim inhibited love relations. It's interesting here, and I wanted to get here quickly, if I could, that he points out in a sort of Marxist vein that private property is one of the primary technologies that society uses to permit the release of aggressive energy. So the ability to possess and own and take away from everyone else uh, property and resources is a very satisfying, he argues, way of indulging one's aggressive instinct. And I think that's a nice and interesting idea that not enough people have pursued with Freud, or really in general in psychoanalysis, that just the urge for private property and capitalism, the basic simple urge. You don't have to be hyper capitalist, you don't have to, be a super ideologist, but just believing in the idea of private property is enough to suggest that I should be able to take things and own them and keep you away from them, and if you try to take them from me, I can punish you or kill you, or something like that. We also have the channel where we can hate outsiders, and that becomes important in other texts, maybe more than this one. The narcissism of tiny differences, where we find little tiny differences between ourselves and someone else. We decide to hate the other person, helps because now we have a common enemy and we can release our aggressive impulses in that way. And then, of course, the main one, which is we just turn that aggression against ourselves through the power of the superego. That takes us to a complicated point, which is the summa, the bridge of the whole second part is essentially civilization is a war between eros and aggression or death, between love and libido and aggression or death. And what happens when we internalize our own aggression? So we have aggressive feelings against father. That becomes terrifying, anxiety producing, illegal, illicit, immoral, whatever. We then internalize, he first argues, the authority that is the father, and sort of introject that authority in our mind. And you would think that he would say, well, then that authority becomes our superego and punishes it. But it's a little more subtle than that. He actually says it's, and it's again, a small difference, but an important one. It's really the reaction to the inability to aggress against the father that produces the rage and aggression in us. So it's, we have on the one hand, we have this kind of Michel Foucauldian idea that we internalize the structures of society and civilization and they become psychic prisons, and we live within them and they enforce the rules of society such that we don't need a police force, really, because we all have internal police and we police ourselves. We watch ourselves. We're on guard against ourselves. We, keep order within our own behavior, to the extent that it makes social regulation almost redundant. Um, The superego punishes us not only when we act, but when we think about acting or wish for acting or even have just a crazy impulse feeling of anger or rage against, say, an authority figure that makes us want to. Um, Forgive me, I got interrupted by a maintenance technician coming to my apartment here in Singapore. I was saying, and I think this is, it's okay that we had a little stoppage because it's easy to get away from ourselves, but we have to consider the renunciation of aggression and violence in society and what that means. And we do that by identifying with the authority that is present in civilization and internalizing it. But to be precise, it's not the aggression of the father toward the child that is internalized. It's the aggression of the child toward the father, which is prohibited and frustrated, that gets turned around and internalized in the figure or imago of punishing father superego in the mind. This becomes then Freud's line, like a garrison in a conquered city. The superego takes on a life of its own. It's fueled by rage and aggression and instinctual energy. And so, in that way, it doesn't really look out for the ego and its wellness so much as wants to satisfy its own aggressive impulses on anything. And it will do so on the ego and punish it and make it feel guilty and make us feel guilty and damaged and drained and hated and unworthy and all of these things. That guilt is essentially Oedipal guilt. I don't want to get too much into Oedipus, but it's the wish to eliminate the same-sex parent as a potential rival, and the wish to couple completely with the other sex parent in Freud, and that those wishes, particularly the aggressive side of that, is really the one that creates the most superego activity and therefore the most guilt. And this is why Freud says guilt is the most important problem in all of civilization. It's a technology that binds us together. It's a result, an inherent result of the renunciations that we have to make in order to live together in a civilized society. And it is therefore the key issue. And in some ways, it would be surprising if you looked at the literature in psychoanalysis to see that guilt is not treated as the number one problem in civilization in, say, the psychosocial literature that I'm most familiar with and that I contribute to the most. We don't look at it that closely. I mean, we have examined it. There's been a lot of examinations of guilt, but it's not treated as the primary issue in civilization for this reason. The final caveat that I'd like to make is Freud says, look, when an instinct is repressed, the libidinal portion of the instinct is transformed into neurotic symptoms. The libidinal repression translates itself into neurotic symptoms. The aggressive components of the instinct or the wish or the drive or the act um, turn into guilt and punishment. And within that claim lies a deeper claim that's really important for Freud and that you should take away from this, which is that for Freud, and I think for many of us after Freud, we want to say that every instinct and every act and every wish even has both a sadistic or aggressive component side to it and an erotic one. And if you read someone like Otto Kernberg, who works a lot with perversions, or if you think a lot about the idea of these two getting mixed up, we can understand a lot about what have been traditionally called perversions in the sadomasochistic realm and elsewhere, where you have fusion of aggressive and erotic reactions or um, uh, prohibitions that turn into internalized new demands for satisfaction that get fused together in complicated ways where love becomes very aggressive or aggression becomes an act of love or something a little bit, confusing like that. So Freud is saying that every wish and every act has both components in within it together, and that becomes, I think, a really crucial part in the second part of Freud's book. So the sum total of all of this is we've discussed how things like um, diversion and distraction and intoxication and substitute satisfactions, sublimation, we've discussed before, identification with others in our community, aim inhibition, which means to look for some other aim for your targeted impulse that's not the one that's prohibited by society, but you love the whole world or the whole humanity or whatever, um, and neurotic symptoms. Um, all are ways to navigate an impossible situation. The impossible situation that is, we are aggressive and flawed human creatures. Um, we possess a number of instincts. They fall into two categories, but we can't forget about the second one, which is the aggressive one. And that's the one that's really the most challenging. And we have to somehow navigate that destructive impulse if we're going to stay together against if we're going to keep our society together against the forces of aggression and death. So civilization aggravates aggression. It sponsors aggression in the way that it denies us the immediate release of aggression. Um, it cycles aggression through onto ourselves and then back out again onto others so that we have aggression that would go to someone else, comes back on ourselves through the superego, then finds a target of externalization, as someone like Van McCulkin would say. And a suitable target for externalization would be someone that we could easily place that aggression on and take it off of ourselves so that we no longer, it's not, the onus is no longer on us, and we can find some relief in that way. Sadomasochism, hatred of the other, self-punishment, all of these things are features of civilization that come through the aggressive channel. And I think that's really the key part of Freud's civilization is discontents, especially the second half, that we need to know in order to understand the text.